Welcome. This video is documenting the prediction that famous singer-songwriter Paul Simon of Simon and Garfunkel will slip and fall and severely injure his head on December 19th, 2025. The post date on the social media platform that you are watching this video on proves that this prediction is being made ahead of time, as does this time-stamped email and forensic notes PDF document. If you are skeptical for some reason, please email me and I will forward these to you. If you have already watched this introductory information regarding November 27th, you can skip ahead no more than precisely 10 minutes. Welcome. This video that you are watching was produced prior to November 27th, 2025, when prior to this date, it was predicted that Paul Simon of Simon and Garfunkel, the famous singer and songwriter, would slip and fall and severely injure his head on this November 27th, 2025 date, Thanksgiving. This is because God's signs, his true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections, which is only being explained on this channel, overwhelmingly indicated that November 27th would be extremely important regarding this trail of signs leading to the date that Paul Simon will slip and fall and injure his head, which is now predicted to be December 19th, 2025. 22 days after November 27th. That's why the clear and relevant signs that occurred on November 27th that related to Paul Simon revealed adding 22 more days to reach December 19th. The signs we received on November 27th are explained in other videos in more detail. But for the sake of this introduction here, I will briefly describe them. But before I do, the key thing to understand here is that when Paul Simon slips and falls and injures his head on December 19th, it will prove that all of the analysis in this video for November 27th is 100% correct and true. That's the purpose of this prediction. In other words, the reason why God does this, why he lays out a trail of signs, it is in order to elaborate on the prophetic signs, because none of the prophetic signs can be properly or fully understood without their context and connections to the other prophetic signs. It is through these connections and context that God is able to tell these stories and themes. And God does this in order to relay extremely important information and knowledge that everyone needs to know. And everyone needs to know how and why God pointed in advance to November 27th, why he did so. And it is explained in these videos that talk about God pointing to November 27th. Now, the skeptic will say, oh, well, he didn't he didn't slip and fall on that day. You were wrong. No. When the prediction comes to pass on December 19th, 22 days later, it will prove all of the analysis for November 27th. And therefore, it will prove that God was indeed pointing to November 27th regarding the slip and fall and injury of his head of Paul Simon. And therefore, all of the knowledge that's contained in these stories that were told in the lead up to November 27th are extremely important. And that's why when the prediction comes to pass, the wise person will recognize that they need to watch every minute of every video on this channel, including all of the videos that predicted November 27th. It was not quote unquote wrong. It was 100% correct. And that will be proven to be true when Paul Simon slips and falls and injures his head on December 19th. Now, why the 22 days from November 27th? Well, one of the signs we received on that day was the first American Pope's first trip abroad to 2 nations. And on the plane flight, the news story was that he was gifted the historic bat used by player number 2. The Chicago White Sox player number 2 was gifted to the Pope, the first American Pope, on his first trip abroad to 2 nations. There's much more to that. He was on, for example, his way to the 1700th anniversary celebration of the Nicene Creed. And on that day, one of the 2 National Guardsmen died, who was shot on 17th Street. And on, as explained in the other video. So we have the 2 and 2, number 2's bat and the 2-nation trip. The first American Pope from Chicago hints at the first black president from Chicago, and on. And the Pope and Obama are the 2 antichrists, except the first of the 2 antichrists, the Pope, is not Pope Leo, but will be Pope Francis, who will, or is predicted to become or be resurrected in April 2029. That's another subject. Okay, so we have, anyway, the 2 antichrists identified once again in God's signs. Now, Paul Simon was known to be an avid baseball fan. That's one reason why this is relevant. Also, his head injury is symbolic of people's heads being injured and their brains being injured from the things. You know what I'm talking about, the things. And the components in the things make their way to people's brains. And that will ultimately lead to demonic possession, and on, as explained in countless other Paul Simon videos. But the mark of the Antichrist, which is the thing, is symbolized by the number 22 in God's signs. And the Antichrists, the 2 Antichrists, will enforce the mark of the Antichrist. The reason why the mark of the Antichrist is symbolized by the number 22 is because the inverse of the mark of the Antichrist is described in the book of Ezekiel, which would have been a Tav mark, and the Tav letter in the Hebrew alphabet is the last and 22nd letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The mark of the Antichrist is described in the last and 22nd book out of 22 books in the Bible that have a total of 22 chapters. Also, the mark of the Antichrist alters a person's chromosomes, and chromosomes come in pairs, and each chromosome has 2 arms, and so 2 and 2, 22. Now, another sign we received on this date was the death of Fuzzy Zoeller, the famous Hall of Famer golfer, professional golfer, Fuzzy Zoeller, who was known for making, and never lived it down for the rest of his life, his racist comment after he had finished the Masters and while Tiger Woods was still playing the Masters on his way to winning his first Masters tournament. The first black player to win the Masters. Again, hints at the first black president, Antichrist. Also, Tiger Woods is the GOAT, greatest of all time, and that hints at the GOAT Antichrist. Now, Fuzzy Zoeller was one of 2 players in the modern era to win the Masters in their first year as a professional. The other player was Tiger Woods. And Tiger Woods is known for his big comeback when he won the Masters 22 years after he first won the Masters in his first year as a professional. And so that's why the death of Fuzzy Zoeller also reveals adding 22 days. Now, there's so much more that's so amazing regarding all of this that is, for one thing, explained in the must-watch, as if all of them are must-watch, as you should know. 2 National Guardsmen shot, 2-nation trip by the Pope video regarding Paul Simon. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. That's the introduction here. Again, like I said, God was pointing to November 27th ahead of time. So the rest of this video will talk about how and why God pointed to November 27th ahead of time. And all of the analysis is 100% correct when the prediction comes to pass 22 days later on December 19th. And so Don't be confused when in this video later on I talk about how Paul Simon is predicted to slip and fall on November 27th. God was saying that. That's what God was saying. It was not, quote unquote, wrong, quote unquote. It was 100% correct. Okay, God was saying that Paul Simon would slip and fall on November 27th. But the way it works, and this is how it works, and I know far better than you or anyone how it works, is that it's not necessarily possible to know ahead of time, ahead of the date that God is pointing to, whether or not it will be the end of the trail of signs for that prediction or another step in the trail. And so November 27th was pointed to, and it was for Paul Simon's trail, and it ended up being a step. Now, December 19th might be a step. But at this time, we're going to go with the prediction that Paul Simon will slip and fall and injure his head on December 19th. If it doesn't happen, you can rest assured there will be clear and relevant signs related to it on December 19th. And that said, enjoy the rest of the video. It must be watched. It's extremely important information, all of these videos. Paul Simon famously opened the first broadcast of Saturday Night Live in New York City after 9/11. He also performed at the 9/11 memorial on the 10-year anniversary. Simon also performed a reunion concert with Garfunkel in Central Park in Manhattan. On 9/11, planes crashed into towers in Manhattan and people died. Okay, I'll just repeat this now. So Simon, again, like I've explained, is associated with 9/11 because he performed at the first broadcast after 9/11 from Manhattan, Saturday Night Live, and also on the 10-year anniversary at the memorial. Okay, now he also performed in Central Park, the reunion concert, which incidentally, I forgot to mention here, was 9 months and 11 days after John Lennon was shot next to Central Park. But that's another subject. On 9/11, planes crashed into towers in Manhattan and people died. On February 23rd, 2024, a famous owl that had escaped the Central Park Zoo crashed his head into a tower in Manhattan and died and collapsed. February 23rd, 2024 is exactly 90 plus 1 plus 1 weeks before the predicted news of Simon's crash and fall and head injury on November 28th, 2025. Okay? So in other words, the owl, the famous owl, okay, his death is a 9/11 sign because he crashed with his head into the tower, right? It's also in Manhattan, furthermore. And Simon is Manhattan symbolism, 9/11 symbolism, and he's predicted to fall and crash and injure his head, like the owl injured his head. Paul Simon's new album, 7 Psalms, has owls on its cover. It uses the famous painting by Thomas Moran, 2 Owls, which hints at the 2 towers on 9/11. One thing that I did write in this paragraph, the owl died, well, another thing actually, the owl was 13 years old and 13 symbolizes America. Paul Simon has a famous hit, America, and also a hit American tune. There were 13 colonies that founded America. That's why, the 13. It's all over the money, for example, the number 13. When they did an autopsy on the owl, it was deduced that the owl would have died anyway. And the reason why he hit the tower is because he was disoriented, and that's why he hit the tower, was because he had ingested rat poison from the rats that he had been eating. And so the owl was poisoned and he injured his head. And this is symbolic of how Paul Simon's head injury is pointing to the poisoning the people do to themselves when they take the thing, the mark of the Antichrist, the thing that you can't talk about. You know what I'm talking about. The thing that goes inside people and poisons them, which will lead to demonic possession and disorientation, etc. The demonic possession will be induced by frequencies, which is what music is, which is why Paul Simon and Elvis Presley, music frequencies travel through the air, and it will trigger things inside the brains of people that will induce delta brain waves, which will facilitate demonic possession. That's why the beginning of Paul Simon's hit, Graceland, the first lyric is, "The Mississippi Delta was shining like a national guitar." Paul Simon famously dated Shelley Duvall and then broke up with her at the airport before she flew to the UK to film the movie The Shining, which is about demonic possession. And also a large hotel, which is mansion symbolism.